the site of the first industrial mill at Willimantic, Connecticut. The Willimantic River is running behind us. We can see the rapids as it goes by, plenty of trees around. Looks a lot like what it would have looked like when Perry Richmond came here in 1822 from Providence, Rhode Island to build a cotton mill. There weren't a whole lot of people that would have been living near this site at the time. The Willimantic River runs through a narrow, rocky gorge. It's an ideal mill stream for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It descends almost 100 feet in a little bit less than a mile. The river is not very deep. You can see it's a shallow river. It's not very wide. It would have been easy to put a dam across a river like this. The Willimantic River, just shortly behind me, comes to an end. It enters on into the Shetucket River, meets the Natchog to form the Shetucket River. So this is the mouth of the river here. Willimantic derives from a Native American word. Some people think it means swift waters, and there are plenty of rapids here as it descends through the gorge. Other people think that it means cedar swamp. And that's apt too, because here at the mouth of the river is a lot of low-lying land that probably was a cedar swamp originally when the first people came to see it. In colonial times, farmers did not live on this site. This was too difficult to farm. It was a combination of low-lying bogs and rocky slopes that would have been very difficult for farming. Most of the farmland was about 3 miles behind me where it was located. And so the millers would have found something like, very much like this at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They would have found lots of trees, they would have found a swift-flowing river, and now they needed to build dams across it to generate the power that would create the American Industrial Revolution. The story of the Industrial Revolution is in large part a story of environmental change. Places like this that are now characterized by large granite rambling mill buildings, places that are now industrial villages and cities, were at one time places that were much more natural in the way that they were constructed. The people that used to inhabit Connecticut, Native Americans, after them the colonial people of the 17th and 18th centuries, didn't live where the mills were located. They lived in the areas where agriculture was possible. Native Americans and colonials alike were farmers, and so they lived in areas in which there was largely flat terrain, dry soils, places where agriculture really worked. The mills are where the waterfalls are. They're in narrow, rocky gorges and ravines like the one behind us here. This is where the power sources would be for the Industrial Revolution, and so this is where the mills would be located. There were people that lived at this site before the Industrial Revolution, but not very many. Willimantic, Connecticut, which is where we are now, was characterized by 2 roads that came through the Willimantic Gorge, one on either side of the river. The river comes through a range of hills here, and so that's a place where you would build roads because there's a gap in the hills. There was a tavern for people who were traveling through. There were a few farms that were located here, but the farmers largely harvested trees rather than crops like corn or other grains. They cut down the oak trees. This was an oak forest in the area that's around us here. There were also there were some small mills that were located here. So there was a grist mill. There was a sawmill. There was, even during the American Revolution, there was a small gunpowder factory that was located here. But these mills were not very large. The mills of colonial times were custom mills. They were operated by the miller and his family and maybe a hired hand or 2. Custom mills meant that essentially the miller was paid in a portion of what he produced. A farmer would bring in a crop of corn, and it would be ground into cornmeal, and the miller would keep a percentage of that, and that was his payment. These were small mills, mostly not on rivers like the Willimantic River behind me, but often even smaller creeks and streams and brooks that could easily be dammed. So when the Industrial Revolution happens at the beginning of the 19th century, what happens is you need bigger mills, you have larger machines, and so they're going to have water power that is going to have to be harnessed in order to move those machines. The environmental change that will occur at this site includes a whole bunch of different sorts of things that are going to be happening. They are going to build dams across the river, like the dam that's behind me here. They are going to have to build raceways, large canal-like structures that will carry water from the river to the mill. The purpose of the dam is to raise the water level of the river to be high enough so that it will spill into the raceway. The raceway then will carry the water to the wheelhouse. This behind me right here, this is the wheelhouse of this particular mill. The wheels, the water wheels that were once there were in the basement of that building, and that L that sticks out from the back of the mill building. And so the water comes in there. Sluice gates would control the amount of water that enters into the raceways. The raceways are large. They're maybe 20 feet across, 10 feet deep. They're lined with stone in order to prevent erosion from occurring, in order to make sure that there's plenty of water that will be in the raceway. After the water is done moving the wheels and comes out of the wheelhouse, then there's a tail race. And there's one of those behind me here that then carries the water back into the river again. This means that an awful lot of earth is going to be moved, an awful lot of stuff has to be built, and an awful lot of environmental transformation is going to be taking place in order to create a really new environment. Of first villages and then cities in the New England countryside is a product of the Industrial Revolution. Native Americans had villages in an earlier period, but those were only a few hundred people each. But now we're going to get villages that number a few thousand, up into cities that will be tens of thousands, and even bigger cities that are going to become the metropoli of modern America. All of this is going to be changed. Here at the Willimantic Gorge, the change occurs in the 1820s. The first mill would be built in 1822. A second mill would be built further upriver, also in 1822. Then a third cotton mill, textile factory, is going to be built very near the first one, the next year in 1823. Then in 1824, there's a fourth one that's built. And then this edifice that's here, the original parts of this particular mill, would be built in the 1850s. In 1793, we have the invention of the cotton gin. And the cotton gin will transform the textile industry not only here in America, but throughout the world. The cotton gin makes it possible to cheaply produce cotton. Cotton is a much more usable form of fabric than wool. It's easier to wash, it's lighter weight, it's more comfortable. People would much rather wear it if it's affordable. And with the invention of the cotton gin, affordable cotton became possible. The cotton, however, was grown in the Deep South. Even places like Virginia and Kentucky are too cold for cotton. The growing season isn't long enough, and certainly one can't grow cotton here in Connecticut and the rest of New England. And so the cotton would have to be shipped up here. We might wonder then, why did the Industrial Revolution begin in America, here in New England, and not in the South, where the cotton is located? The clue to that can be found in a marvelous book by the English historian Phyllis Dean. Dean writes about the English Industrial Revolution, but what she's doing is she's describing what's needed for industrialization to take place. It's not just the invention of technology, but there are several other things that have to come together. A raw material is needed, first wool, then cotton, but there's more than that. You need liquid capital. The South had plenty of capital, but the Southern capital was invested in plantations and slaves. It's not liquid capital. It's not cash that could be easily invested. Here in New England, there was a lot of liquid capital. Liquid capital produced by the shipping industry, much of it the slave trade, but there was surplus cash that could be invested in risky new things like factories and new technologies that nobody was sure were really going to work. In addition to that, you need a pool of surplus labor. You need cheap labor. You need people who will come and work in your factories and not have to pay them very much. In the South, Surplus labor existed in the form of slaves, which is to say it's not a surplus labor. Slaves weren't free to go take jobs in factories, and the owners of the slaves in the South preferred to use them as plantation labor. Here in New England, what we have is an overpopulation of the countryside. Those very farm towns that were located 3 miles that way, or another 3 miles behind us in that direction, those towns were getting full up. They had population densities that were starting to exceed 40, 50, 60 people per square mile, and there was no longer enough farmland for everybody. Sometimes whole families, but more often the teenage sons and especially the daughters of the farmers would then go and take jobs, sometimes not for an entire year, sometimes part-time jobs, but take jobs working as operatives in the cotton mill to earn extra money for the farm family, often to help pay the taxes on the farm. And so there was a surplus population. But most important of all was the need for an energy source, a power source that would operate those heavy machines. And the power source of the late 1700s and especially the early 1800s was falling water. This was what people knew how to use. They had used falling water to operate smaller mills for generations. They understood the basic technology of building dams and raceways and water wheels. They just now had to make them bigger because they had to concentrate enough power to run machines that were much larger than the machinery they had before. So they move away from the small little brooks and creeks of colonial times into the custom mills, and they look for rivers like this. They don't want really big rivers. The Hudson River is way too big to put a dam across. The Connecticut River is too big to dam as well. But rivers like the Willimantic River, the Natchog River, the Hop River, the Quinnebog River, and later on in the 1800s, the Chautauqua River, those rivers were of just the right size. Bigger than the brooks, and so therefore there was more power, but not so big that you couldn't put a dam across them. They also are looking for a drop. The power source is gravity. It's water going downhill that creates the power source. And so really what you need in order to have good water power is you have to have a lot of rain so that you have water in your rivers, and you have to have a lot of hills. We've got that in abundance here in New England. Lots of hills and lots of rain. More than that, the hills here in New England go almost all the way to the seacoast. And so you can have a seaport that's not very far away from your mill. The main seaport for Willimantic would be Norwich, Connecticut, which is located less than 20 miles in that direction. Not very far at all. So it was possible to be able to move things even before the railroad. It was possible to be able to move product back and forth between the mills and the seaports. So what happens is that entrepreneurs looking to create industry in America, looking to create the textile mills that were churning out large profits in Britain to duplicate those here in America, are looking for sites very much like the British mills. They're looking for waterfalls. The Willimantic River descends between 90 and 100 feet in less than a mile. By contrast, the Connecticut River, although much wider and deeper with a greater volume of water, the Connecticut River descends about 90 feet all the way from the Massachusetts border to Long Island Sound. That's not enough of a drop. It's the drop rather than the volume that produces the water power. So it's sites like this that attracted millers. And so they came in and they started to build large mill buildings like the one that we see here behind me. Initially, the rivers are a source of water power. And they're used for that. They're used to turn the large wheels that are located in the wheelhouses of the mills that we have here. The rivers serve another purpose for the mills as well. Not as transportation, because you can't get boats in rivers like this. These rivers are too shallow and narrow for ships to be able to come up to places like Willimantic. But what you do have with rivers like this is you have a system to carry away waste. And so if you're making textiles, you have to dye them. And so you have leftover dye from the dye vats, and you have to get rid of it somewhere. And this is where it goes. It gets dumped right into the river itself. It's said here in Willimantic that they actually would begin with the lighter colored dyes at this particular factory early in the week. And so on Monday and Tuesday, they do the light colored dyes, and then what they do as the week progressed is they move on to the darker dyes. It works better that way with your dye vats. If there's a little bit of the light colored dye left in the vat, it's going to be covered up by the darker dye that's there later on. The result is that people used to say that you could tell what day of the week it was in Willimantic by looking at the color of the river. It is hard for us today to imagine what these rivers look like. Since the Clean Water Act of the 1970s, the river has been cleaned up. Fish now live in this river. It's sparkling blue. It's a beautiful river that's here. We can't imagine what it used to look like, that it would have been bright colors with all the dye that were there, that the fish, those that managed to survive the building of the dams, those fish would have been killed by dyes, and they dumped raw sewage into the river as well, not just from the mills, but from the mill villages and the cities that grew up around them. The sewage was just carried in pipes and dumped directly into the rivers. The rivers were horribly polluted by the end of the 19th century. The stone that was used to build the dams, to line the raceways, to build the big mill buildings like this is a local granite. It's all produced on site. The type of granite that's here is called Gneiss. It's spelled Gneiss. It's German, so that's why it's spelled funny like that. Looks like it should be Gneiss or something like that, but in German that's pronounced Gneiss. So it's a nice granite. We can think of it as a very nice granite. It's pretty strong, it's pretty tough, and it's what's under the soil that's here. The gneiss is really intermixed with layers of shale, and that forms the basic bedrock of most of the areas here in New England where the mills were built. So what we're doing is we're building urban centers, large urban places, places where there are mills, but also places where people live. So when the mills come in, one of the first things they do besides building mill buildings is they build housing. There's company housing that they build for their workers, mostly in the form of row houses. They build some apartment houses, they build some boarding houses, but they're more interested in hiring families than they are in hiring single workers. If you hire a man, you not only get his labor, you get his wife's labor, and you only have to pay her half as much as you would pay him. You get his children's labor, and they're paid even less. So what you've got is a lot of very low-cost labor. So they built a lot of family housing in the form of row houses that were created. The row houses tend to be located within short walking distance of the mills. The workers didn't have their own horses. They didn't have their own wagons. They couldn't afford something like that. They had to walk to work. And so it's located very nearby. What then happens is, as you get all these people there, well, they need services. They need food. They need to be able to shop. And initially, the mills build company stores. But as time goes by, merchants come to locate into these areas, and they build stores of their own. And so what happens is several what were really kind of separate mill villages, 5 little mill villages in this mile along the Willimantic Gorge, will sort of grow together over the course of the early decades of the 1800s, so that by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, we start to get whole cities. Churches are built, schools are built, theaters are built, all kinds of things are going to be here. The cities that are created, the villages and cities that are created, are what historians call organic cities. It's a really cool phrase, the phrase organic city, because it really differentiates the difference between a 19th century industrial city and a city today. In the 19th century, people lived with large animals all around them. There were animals as well as people who worked at the mill. Middle-class people often had carriage houses. They would have a wagon. They'd have a horse or two. You have to be able to put that horse somewhere. There were livery stables along Main Street where you could rent a horse if you needed to do that, and rent a wagon if you needed to do something like that. Middle-class people had cows, and they milked those cows, and that's where milk came from. This is an era before refrigerators, before even ice boxes throughout most of the 19th century. And so milk, cheese, butter had to be produced locally. You couldn't ship it in over long distances. Refrigerated railroad cars wouldn't come in until the end of the 19th century. So you had to produce milk products locally, so people tended to have those things. The mill workers couldn't afford cows, but they had chickens and sometimes even pigs. We see that from one of the early leases from one of the mills, the lease that was used by in the worker housing, that the workers had, that's the list of rules that workers had to abide by. One of the rules says the keeping of swine and fowls is strictly forbidden. No pigs in the house. And they meant in the house. You could have them outdoors. They just didn't want them inside. On a really cold winter day, if your pig is being threatened with freezing, and that's your big investment, you're going to be thinking you might like to bring that pig indoors. And so we can see that people would have been tempted to do things like that, to bring animals inside during cold weather. People then lived with animals all the time, with livestock kind of animals that were all around them, chickens to eat, chickens for eggs. Those were all around them, and people were used to living with them. That meant you had to feed them. And so what we have is surrounding Willimantic, surrounding all of these other 19th century organic mill cities, is a ring of farms. The farms produce food for people, vegetables, corn, other grain crops. They were orchards, mostly apples, that would have been here, that would have been brought in for people, and so you could buy them in the markets of these cities. But in addition to that, there's also hay for the cattle, hay for the horses, food for the animals, oats that was grown for the animals to be able to eat. Early pictures show loaded hay wagons creaking along, working their way down Hosmer Mountain along winding dirt roads as they come on into Willimantic, bringing locally produced food into town. And then, of course, something goes back out the other way. Not only do historians talk about organic cities, where people and animals live side by side, where food is produced locally, but they also talk about something called the organic conveyor belt. The organic conveyor belt means food comes in and manure goes out. And when we're talking manure, we're not just talking the manure produced by the horses and the cattle, although that was the best manure. We're also talking about human manure as well. There are outhouses that are here. Before they put in any kind of a sewer system, and the sewers are not put in, the sewer pipes are not put in until the 1890s, people have outdoor privies. That still doesn't mean that things aren't getting into the river, that the privies leak. These are just dirt vaults underneath the privies, and so the effluent comes down through the soil. It gets into the river, and so the sewerage is going to be there, but that's the liquid sewage. The solid sewerage gathers in the vault under your privy until one day you go into your privy and there is no more room for anything else in the privy, and it's time to call what were called the necessary tub men, because your privy was called a necessary, and, well, they called it also a tub. And the tub men also had these tubs on wagons, and they would come in and collect what was called night soil, because they did this job at night, and they would climb down into the privy and shovel out what was there and toss it up into the tub and bring it out into the countryside and sell it to the farmers. So it's a conveyor belt. Food in, manure out, is part of this organic conveyor belt of these early industrial cities. As the century progresses, what happens is the middle class that grows up in these industrial cities decides that it doesn't want to live right near the mills anymore. The mills are noisy. It's hot in the valley in the middle of the summer. It doesn't smell all that good around the mills because of all the animals and people that live there. And more to the fact, there starts to be a problem with air pollution. Air pollution is a whole new story that comes in the middle of the century. Until the middle of the 1800s, the power source was really entirely falling water. In order to make sure there was plenty of water in the river, they actually built auxiliary dams that are upstream. They create lakes upstream. most of the lakes in Connecticut today, almost all of the lakes in Connecticut today are artificial, and the majority of them were actually built in the 19th century by mills to make sure that there would be plenty of water in the mill rivers in order to move the water wheels during the hot months of August when there's not a lot of rainfall and water levels in the mill begin to drop. So, okay, you've got the water that's there, and you've got exclusively this water power as your source of power, but it's chancy. Even with those mills those dams upstream, those lakes upstream, ponding extra water, that's still not always going to have water. There were days in the summer when the mills would actually close down because there's not enough water to actually turn the water wheels. So there's always a search for another source of power. The other source of power comes in the middle of the century. In Connecticut, it comes in right after the Civil War. Civil War is the 1860s. So as we move on to the late 1860s and into the 1870s, what we see is coal power, steam power. Coal-powered steam boilers are brought in. The earliest steam boilers, which are probably maybe even in the 1850s, were used for heat in the mills. Before that, the temperature in the mill was, well, whatever it was. Hot in the summertime, probably a bit chilly in the wintertime, but they're able to heat the buildings in the wintertime by putting in steam heat. But what happens after the Civil War in the 1870s is they begin to start to use the steam power to make the machinery move. First is an auxiliary source of power to the water power, and then it takes over for the water power. If we were filming on this site 5 years ago, we would see right here behind us the central feature of this landscape, which now no longer exists. A huge, big brick smokestack rising high above the mill buildings. So high that actually goes above the forests of this part of Connecticut. It's the first thing that you would have seen as you were entering Willimantic or the other mill towns that had these things. These were brick smokestacks. A brick structure generally will last about 100 years before it needs repairs. After the mills were abandoned and no longer being used, the smokestacks were not functional anymore, and so they began to deteriorate. Bricks fell loose and the smokestack was taken down just a few years ago. But those smokestacks really signaled a move to a different source of power that's going to be coming on in. The steam power that they're going to be using to power these factories. So they can do that. They can do that because of the railroad. The first train to arrive in Willimantic was in 1849. So think about it. First factory, 1822. Railroad not till 1849. Clearly, railroads were not a cause of the Industrial Revolution. Railroads were a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. The first railroad to arrive here at this site in Willimantic was a short line. It came up from Norwich, Connecticut, less than 20 miles away, and it came here. All over New England, in the middle years of the 1800s, they were building short line railroads that connected a mill to a seaport so that you could bring the goods back and forth. And that kind of transportation was occurring. And not until 1849. The first train to arrive in Willimantic actually broke down partway here, and they had to hitch a team of horses to it that pulled it the rest of the way in. There was a lot of technology to work out. But the trains were steam powered. They were steam trains with steam boilers with coal. And they could carry large amounts of coal. So when the trains come in, not only are they bringing bales of cotton that come from the south, they're also bringing carloads of coal, and that enables people to heat their homes with coal furnaces. It also enables them to power the machinery in the mills, and there's a switchover. But what that means is this switch that takes place from water power to coal power means that now we're not just polluting the water, we're polluting the air as well. There are some neat sketches of late 19th century Willimantic that show the mills and the trains with black smoke belching out of the towers, filling the air. And well, if you can afford to move onto the hilltops away from all of that smoke, maybe that's a good idea. The middle class literally moved uphill. they moved into what are now a series of beautiful Victorian houses, mansions, and cottages that were on the hill slopes, leaving the areas in the valley for the workers to live in. Workers that by the middle of the century are increasingly immigrants. When they build the railroads, a lot of the people who worked on the railroads and built them were Irish immigrants who came fleeing the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. And so the Irish now join the Yankees as workers in the mill. In the 1870s, large amounts of French Canadians. Starting in 1955, the last major immigrant group to come and work in the mills, Puerto Ricans, Spanish-speaking folks coming from Puerto Rico are moving on up here as well. We have counted 26 different languages spoken in the mills here in Willimantic, and undoubtedly we've missed a few. The cemeteries of eastern New England are full of French names and Polish names, and Jewish names and German names and Italian names, and even some Chinese and Japanese names and Spanish names that all start to appear. If we look at cemetery construction in these mill towns in the late 1800s and early 20th century, we start to see special, separate Catholic and Jewish cemeteries being built for different ethnic groups that are coming here, all sorts of different people who come to live in this area. So we've got all of these different groups, and they're the ones that are going to live within walking distance of the mills. They're going to be right down here where the mills are, in an area where there's much greater air pollution, where you don't have nice yards for your children to play in, where you don't have as much shade, where it's not as comfortable. And so a movement begins to create public parks where the mills are located. And so we're going to get things like that. We're going to get the creation of parks. Here in Willimantic and in other mill communities, the earliest parks are built by the mills. So the Willimantic Linen Company, which despite its name made cotton thread, and this was them, this was their location here, what they did is they were building a new neighborhood located, about a quarter of a mile, kind of off in that direction, a model neighborhood of freestanding little Victorian cottages for mill worker families. And so they call it the Oaks, because there used to be oak trees living there, and they decided to put a park in. And they do, and this is in 1882. They built a little park with a little dance stand at. It's not very big, but it was popular and people liked it. So the next year, in 1883, the Willimantic Linen Company took 200 acres next to one of its mill buildings that it owned, and it created a public park. It was a county agricultural fairgrounds. They put in an oval racetrack because in the late 1800s, the most popular spectator sport in America was horse racing. And people loved to watch the horse races. This wasn't jockeys on horses. This was the horses that pulled the little carriages behind them. And so we would have that kind of racing. Harness racing is what they would have had. They also put in baseball diamonds because after horse racing, the second most popular sport was baseball. And so they put that as well. And the baseball wasn't just a spectator sport. That was participatory. That was people could come and play themselves. And so we have this as a fairground. It remained the Willimantic Fairgrounds for a little over 30 years until finally there was an illegal betting scandal that occurred that caused the Harness Racing Authority to suspend racing. And at that point, the mill, which still owned the site, decided to convert this fairground into what's today called Recreation Park. They did this in 1915, and Recreation Park means it's a park for recreation. And the people who went there mostly would have been mill workers and their families. They would have played baseball. The mills had several baseball teams that played against each other in various branches of the mill. After a few years of having several teams play each other, they consolidated them into one all-star team that they had that could play teams from other mills located in other towns in eastern Connecticut. They even once hosted a visiting squad from the Boston Red Stockings in 1918 and defeated them before a crowd of around 8,000 local people who excitedly showed up to see this event occurring. In the wintertime, they flooded the park, and there was ice skating that took place there. So we're creating, as part of this new environment, we're creating parks. What the mill also did is they lined Main Street outside of the mill with shade trees. They planted elms. These elms were not on where the commercial stores were. There were no trees, hardly, just a few. They were up on the Main Street area where the stores were. But by the mills, there were trees on either side of the streets. All of this part of this new environment that's being created by the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Some of it awful pollution, some of it not, but an environment that really, in its structure, in its face, is very different from the mostly wild, tree-clad environment that would have been here before 1822. Steam power was coming in then, and important in the 1870s, even more so in the 1880s, replacing water power as the main source of power for the mills. But as it turns out, on this very site, in this very building here, something incredibly exciting happened in 1879. We believe that this is probably the first factory in the entire world to be lit with electric lights. They weren't bulbs, they were arc lights, where you have two nodes and a spark jumps back and forth between them with no glass bulb over it. You can imagine the fire hazard that must have been. The lights are fantastic. They would light up the whole space. You could be open all night long if you wanted to. But boy, with sparks jumping around in the air and with all that cotton dust and lint around, it's also a tremendous fire hazard. So, something else happened in 1879. Not only did they put in these arc lamps in 1879, but what also happened is down in New Jersey, Thomas Edison developed the first marketable light bulb in that very same year of 1879. So the next year, in 1880, they hired Edison. He came up here, he installed his electric bulbs, his incandescent bulbs in this building, and for good measure, they put in electric lights on Main Street. They generated the power out of the dams in the river, and so they were producing their own electric power. They made so much money doing that, they created a spin-off corporation that they called the Hartford Electric Light Company, which later became CL&P, the major producer of electric power here in Connecticut. And so electric power also starts to come in the late 19th century to these mills. The period 1880 to 1920 witnessed sustained growth in the textile industry, both here in New England and in the South. New mills were being built in the southern part of the United States to take advantage of the proximity of the cotton fields. Now that steam power was replacing water power as the motivating force for the machinery, coal being dug out of the Appalachian Mountains could be shipped by rail to southern factories at an even closer distance than it would take to ship the coal up here to Connecticut and the rest of New England. It's also possible to generate electricity in the mountains of the South and use that to power the mills as well. And the South, after the Civil War, had cheap labor. As the Appalachian Mountains began to decline environmentally as an agricultural area from years and years of over-farming, surplus populations of poor white mountain folk began to come down out of the mountains looking for work. And the work they found was in the textile mills, which were located right on the edge of the mountains in the South. Yet, nevertheless, the textile industry in the North continued to move along at its normal pace. Nobody in the North realized that a shift was taking place because the northern mills still operated profitably, especially up through World War I, when the U.S. government, in the form of the military, increased its demands for textiles for uniforms, tents, cots, bandages, and other war material. But when World War I came to an end and the country moved into the 1920s, the New England textile industry began to experience a very different reality. The loss of government contracts meant a contraction in the textile factories here in Connecticut and the rest of New England. And what happened is there was a sudden realization by the owners of those mills that they now had stiff competition from the South and from other countries, that the amount of textiles being produced globally throughout the world had increased exponentially and prices were going down. And so what the owners of the mills did is they attempted to make up for declining profits by cutting wages. Workers were paid not by the hour back then, but by something called piece rate. You were paid by how much you actually produced in a given period of time. And so what the mills did is they cut the piece rate. And so workers would be paid less per unit of material that they created. So that if you were paid a certain number of cents per 100 yards of thread, well, okay, they're cutting that. That's being reduced. That turned out to be counterproductive, because what happened is workers faced with declining piece rates, this is called a speed up. Workers work faster. They want to have the same amount of income that they've always had, so they work faster so that they can produce more stuff so that they make the same amount of money per week as they'd always made. That means in an era in which you already have overproduction of textiles and declining prices, you now have even more overproduction of textiles and even more declining prices, and the mills of New England responded by further lowering the piece rates in what really was a negative cycle that here in Willimantic reached its low point in 1925 when the workers at the American Thread Company went out on strike. All of them. All 2,500 workers went out on strike. The mills hired replacement workers, they weathered the strike, they broke the union, and when the mill opened up again, there weren't 2,500 jobs, there were 1,700 jobs. Because what the mills now realized is speed-ups weren't going to work, that just increases overproduction. They needed to decrease production, and they decided the way to do that was to decrease their workforce. And so we're now going to enter into a long period of decline as the workforce in the New England mills gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the mills are attempting to deal with the problems of global overproduction, competition from the South, competition from other countries. There was a temporary resurgence during World War II. Once again, the government was putting in orders for thread and cloth for uniforms and tents and bandages and things of that nature. And during World War II and the early years of the Cold War, the 1940s and 1950s, there was what looked like a promise of a better future that was coming along. And that was with artificial textiles. Moving away from just producing cottons and woolens and linens, natural textiles, which are the kinds of things that the mills had made for all of those decades, into producing newly invented artificial substances. Nylon is the first, which is really an artificial silk, then rayon and orlon and all of those other ons that are invented. And they're really invented in the time of just before World War II, with nylon is invented in the late 1930s because the imports of natural silk from Japan were drying up. And what's then continuing beyond that is all these new things. We get a whole bunch of new fabrics. The mills are putting a lot of money into scientific investigations and building laboratories and finding new things, and it looks like a temporary resurgence, and there is. The mills kind of gear up again, and the number of jobs increases, but it's only temporary. By the time we get to the middle of the 1960s, we're back to decline again. Only now it isn't the industry moving so much to the south. The industry was moving overseas. It was leaving the United States in general to go to places where the cost of labor is enormously low, you don't pay workers much at all, and where there were no environmental protection laws. And you can pollute all you want to and nobody is going to tell you not to do that. And so the textile industry has moved to India, China, Indonesia, and places like that. There are other reasons why it's appropriate to be here in a park to talk about the industrial ecosystem. When we think about the industrial ecosystem, the things that come to mind are the polluted rivers, the polluted skies, and the crowded conditions. But what is also there is there's also kind of a counter trend that's going on. And that counter trend included things like parks and trees. One of the things that the mill did is that it actually planted rows of elm trees and shade trees in front of the mill buildings to decorate Main Street here in Willimantic. It also built parks. It built a recreation park for its workers to use to play baseball games in. There was horse racing there and all kinds of other activities and other parks that end up being built by the mills. And so we get a kind of a green coming in as well. When we're thinking about the industrial ecosystem, it's the attempts to create greenery that are significant. One of the things that we have here in this park as decoration is a reproduction of a painting. The painting is by the American Impressionist J. Alden Weir. He was one of the most important American Impressionists. He lived not far from here, only about 3 miles away, in the village of Windham Center. And Weir was really interested in trying to find a middle landscape, a place that was not pure wilderness, but a place that was also not complete cityscape. His studios were in New York City. That was way too built up for him. He thought of relocating to the Adirondacks in New York. No, that was too wildernessy, he thought. And so he was searching for a way that things could come together. And he actually thought he found it here in Willimantic. And so the painting that's there, it's called The Mill Village, actually depicts stone mill buildings, but there are trees around it. So we can see that there's a little bit of nature. And he depicts the towers of the mill buildings and the spires of the churches and even the telegraph poles as sort of artificial trees that he mixes in with real trees to show that there can be created a harmony between artifice and nature. It was probably not realistic. Other drawings show that there was a whole lot more coal smoke in the air in the 1890s when Weir did his painting than what he showed. But it was a noble dream. It was something people were reaching for, and it's something that people who live in these former mill communities are still reaching for when they're creating parks like this. And so we have grass and trees and bushes, we have paintings, we have benches, we also have artwork here in the park that depicts the diverse ethnic structure of communities like this. We have what we call the peace pole here, and the peace pole actually takes the word peace and puts it into several different languages that would have been spoken by the 26 plus different ethnic groups that worked here in the mills. There's a bench also donated by the local Irish American Society to point out that the Irish were one of the major ethnic groups that came here to work in these mills. In 1985, the American Thread Company in Willimantic closed its doors, and it was shut down. In 1995, the last textile factory in Willimantic, a small mill that made silk ribbons, closed its doors. Today, there is one textile factory left in all of Connecticut. It's located in Stafford Springs in the old Warren Mill up there. It's owned by an Italian corporation. They make extremely expensive high-end fabrics, and they're here just to be near the New York market, basically. It's an aberration, though. It's not a pattern that's going to continue to the future. There are people who believe the textile industry will come back to New England, but if it does, it'll be as what are called dark factories, highly automated, using robot labor forces, where actually you have no workers in a room, which means you shut off the lights and you turn down the heat and you save a lot of money that way. That may be the case, but that's not going to be jobs. The reality is the textile industry, as we knew it, is not coming back and is never coming back to New England. Those days are gone. One of the other major questions people ask when they visit the Mill Museum is, what are these buildings being used for today? These old mill buildings that are still part of our landscape, still part of the ecosystem of Connecticut. What are the dams being used for? What are the rivers being used for? What's the future for all of this? These are really good questions. They're questions that people in Connecticut are grappling with even today as they attempt to solve complex problems. And so one of the things is most of the mill buildings are gone. Here on this site in Willimantic, where the old American Thread Company is in existence, people marvel at the old granite mill buildings that are here. But more than half of the mills, well over half of the mills, have been torn down. Those buildings are gone, and they're not coming back. They've been taken away. So we've reduced the number of buildings that are here. What's in these buildings? They first hoped that light industry could be convinced to move into them. That didn't work. They then hoped to convert them to office space or warehouse space, and some of them still are warehouses and some of them are office space, but there's not enough market for either one of those things locally. And so what a lot of them are being turned into is housing. People are coming to live there. And that reflects the real transition that's happening here in Willimantic as a former mill town. Willimantic is on the cusp of what historians are calling the post-industrial transition. The end of the Industrial Revolution brought major changes. The mills shut down, the low-paying jobs in the mills ended, so did the higher-paying management jobs and science jobs and research jobs that were in the mills. All of those disappeared and were gone. What happened is that the mill managers and owners of smaller mills moved away. They left, or they died and weren't replaced. This is called social decapitation. The people who were the upper class, who were the social leaders, have vanished. And what's had to happen is the middle class has had to step in and shoulder the responsibility of authoring a new future and of funding projects within these communities. Something that's not easy for the middle class to do because they're not as affluent as the mill managers used to be. And so that's part of the change occurring as well. The other part of the change of this post-industrial transition is maybe a little more interesting and maybe a little more positive, is that communities like Willimantic are now starting to look at what industries are going to be the bedrock industries in the post-industrial era. And people who have studied this, historians and political scientists and sociologists and economists who have studied this post-industrial transition sort of argue that the future is likely to be built around things like healthcare, things like research and development for advanced technologies like microtechnology and things like that, around recreation and arts and culture kinds of activities, around government jobs, and around education. So here in Willimantic, the major employer today is Eastern Connecticut State University. Another major employer, only 8 miles away, the University of Connecticut. They're moving in to sort of become the major employers of the area today. There's also a number of private educational employers in the area. There's also healthcare in the area. Will these things generate enough jobs to take the place of the old mills? It's a great question. Nobody really has an answer to it. We have to wait and see how the future unfolds. The other question is, what happens to this environment? When the mills left, they left behind an industrial mess. They left behind all sorts of contaminants and chemicals and things that we don't really want here. Major cleanups have had to take place on these sites. These cleanups have been expensive. They've had to be paid for largely out of tax dollars, whether it's federal, state, or local money. Somebody has had to foot the bill for all of that. The cleanup here in Willimantic is not complete. There's still part of the site here that needs to be cleaned up, although most of it has been. Recently, at the Mill Museum, we uncovered an old map that shows the location of what had been the industrial dump for the American Thread Company. That has not been totally cleaned up, that site, although much of it has been. And so there's still work that needs to be done in places like this. There's also the question about what to do with the old mill buildings. It's tempting to say, why not just abandon them and leave them if nobody wants them? But what happens is people break into them, people go into them, they set fires, the fires occur in environments that are full of industrial contaminants which are turned into smoke, and all of that goes up into the air and can be dangerous and threatening. And so communities have had to shoulder the cost of rehabbing the buildings or tearing down the buildings, both of which are expensive things to do. And all of this usually is supported by subsidies, government subsidies, because private business, it's just too expensive for them to take over an old mill building and rehab it on their own dime. That's an expensive thing for them to do. It'd be cheaper for them to build new buildings on their own. What do you do with the dams? Some people want to tear them down to allow the fish to migrate better in the streams and in the rivers. Other people think, well, they'd be great for shooting a kayak over. And so there's talk of a whitewater park here in Willimantic. What's the condition of the air and the water? You can see the blue skies behind us. The air is a lot cleaner than it used to be. So is the water. People fish today in the Willimantic River. We have a sewage treatment plant that's here. I wouldn't drink it, but it's way better than it used to be. There's been a major cleanup that's taken place in the environment. The post-industrial environment that's emerging here in Willimantic and the other mill towns is a cleaner and probably healthier environment than the one we had 100 years ago.